Yes, there are standards. However, there are many surveyors that will go rogue, which would be the appropriate descriptor, and they go rogue because of either facts that they believe are true, but they aren't, and they push them, or they've been to a seminar somewhere where somebody said something.
Beyond Clean offers a creative look into the inner workings of a healthcare industry committed to getting it right every instrument, every time. Join us every week as we explore the hidden world of one of the most important aspects of safe surgical care. And now your hosts, Michael Matthews, Hank Balch, and Justin Poulin.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Barbara Harmer, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. This is part 2 of 2 podcasts that we did with Barbara, all focused on surveying. So this is a very interesting topic. I do have to tell you, Barbara is a highly skilled, knowledgeable, and visionary perioperative nursing leader. She has over 36 years of administrative and clinical management experience, both internal and external consulting in both inpatient, outpatient, and multi-campus healthcare facilities. She's the founder and president of MedAssist Consultants Incorporated, a highly respected and experienced consulting company. She's been there for over 28 years and successfully provided medical and surgical consulting services to over 300 clients, both nationally and internationally. She's got a demonstrated record with increasingly challenging healthcare leadership positions and is a sought-after speaker for local, regional, and national symposiums and conventions. As we mentioned in part 1, she was also a guest panelist at our 2018 Isham Annual Conference and Expo, first ever panel discussion on packaging method myth busting. Now we're bringing you great content about the Joint Commission survey. Again, as we mentioned on part 1, a big topic, one that we've received lots of downloads and requests for more information on. And so we're going to leap off part 1 from several weeks ago, bring you part 2 and more good tips and hints for how to survive the survey. And Barbara really killed it in part 1. I expect the same in part 2, Hank.
In particular for this part 2, Justin, we're going to talk about how to challenge a surveyor if you need to. One of the first questions out of the box that we're going to throw out there is the surveyor always right? It can be intimidating, as we spoke about in part 1, to confront someone who is coming in with all the power of their agency behind them and to think, well, I'm just a little old manager, what do I know or what can I say? But if you are the expert, which your credentials say that you are, you have the ability to clarify and to ask questions and ultimately, if you need to take a stand. And that's the kind of perspective that we're going to be talking to Barbara about on this segment.
Yeah, she really teed that up well at the very end of part 1. And so this flows very smoothly into part 2. Before we get started, just a reminder, we'd love to have you as a subscriber to the podcast. That way you have access to each and every episode every single week. You already know that you can subscribe to Beyond Clean on iTunes and Stitcher, but recently we added Google Play and Spotify and would encourage you to search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application if it's not one of those main 4. Also, if you don't have a favorite podcast application and you don't have iTunes or Stitcher, we can also be heard on the Sterile Education app with lots of other great educational content. That app is available on iTunes and Android. You'll be able to get every single episode every week at the exact same time it's released to all other outlets. For social media, follow Beyond Clean on Twitter at Beyond Clean Info, Facebook.com/Beyond Clean Podcast, LinkedIn.com/company/Beyond Clean. The Instagram page, you can find us Beyond Clean Podcast. We'll post your pictures anonymously. You can go check out the library that we're building today. And if you want to submit a picture or if you've got a recommendation for a future guest or future topic on another episode, simply send an email to info@beyondclean.net. We'll be right back with Barbara Harmer, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. Joining us now again for part 2 is Barbara Harmer, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, LLC. Part 1 had a lot of good nuggets of information. I think we finished on talking about how you can respectfully challenge the surveyor, and that really leaps right into our first question for part 2, really talking about expertise versus accreditation. What are some of the challenges to the surveying process? And we'll pick it right up with, and Barbara, I want to cue you right up here. As you said, you can respectfully challenge the surveyor. Is the surveyor always right?
Unfortunately not, because no matter how good your surveyor is, they are not good in every single subject matter that they're surveying. I haven't met anyone who is perfect. And surveys, one of my favorite statements always when I do instructions, is that surveys are only as good as the surveyors that are sent to you. And so by that I mean that, when you go into, I'll give you the example that someone told me many years ago, when you go into a physician's office and you see the diploma on the wall, it doesn't tell you what subjects he or she flunked. And so it's the same thing with the surveyor. You might not necessarily be able to read what their strengths and their weaknesses are, but trust me, they have strengths as well as weaknesses. So no, surveyors are not always correct. And how much do they really know about SPD? It's all according to what their training and their relevant experience has been. Again, if it's one that's been force-fed and they've never stepped in an SPD before to work in that area, then they're probably going to know very little about it. But that's where the responsibility comes back to the organization and the staff members that have been entrusted with not only managing the department, but also being staff members. There are some hierarchies, and maybe it's just my own personal flavor when it comes to management, is the manager is just important as every staff member in that department. That person is supposed to be leading the staff. But the important things for both of those groups is that they know the facts. And by knowing the facts, I mean you need to know about everything you use in the department, whether it be on a computer, whether it be in a book, whether you have both. But if you don't know, then you have to be forward enough to ask the questions. And if you know the facts and a surveyor comes in, knowing that the surveyor might not be in his or her comfort zone in an SPD, but yet they've been assigned to survey this particular area, you should shine, because the facts, in the end, will win out.
So I'm going to give another definition to IFU right here and say important facts for use. As you mentioned, all of the equipment, all the supplies, all the chemicals, obviously, I cannot agree more. If you know all that you need to know about all those items and how they're used and how they're supposed to be used and what the manufacturer says, you're going to be way far down the highway there when a surveyor comes in, as opposed to the answers that I get a lot when I'm in the field doing these prep surveys. And the response is, well, I do this because that's what Johnny told me to do, or this is the way that I was trained. And, that's not a wrong answer necessarily in that it didn't happen, but that's not the information that the surveyor is trying to get at. So, yeah, that's a great point. I did want to follow up, though. I alluded there to the manufacturer's instructions, but I think one of the hot potato questions in all of this is on the industry side. I guess my question is there such a thing as industry standards for sterile processing, or is it actually every man and woman for themselves with a few recommendations out there to serve as guardrails?
So I think, in a general sense, the standards that are applied to an SPD Most of them come directly from infection control guidelines. There, of course, is the added feature of the equipment of sterilizers and ultrasonics and dryers and, ETO and all the different various modalities of sterilization, high-level disinfection. And so each of those will have their own cross to bear. However, the actual standards, when you're talking about a regulatory agency, the regulatory agencies being your Department of Health and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they're your regulatory bodies. The accreditation organizations are not regulatory. They're accreditation organizations. And accreditation many, many years ago was voluntary. Accreditation became less voluntary when deemed status went into effect, where those organizations, if they were approved by CMS, could conduct what's called the deemed status survey. And so the volunteerism went away, and then you got more into the mandatory session. And so on the mandatory section of it now, though, you have insurance, third-party insurance payers who now demand that you become accredited. And so there's an immense amount of pressure on the organization to make sure that they have a successful survey. And in that realm, they, of course, want people to get high grades, less deficiencies, and not have to write until their keyboards expire for corrections to the deficiency list that they could get. So, yes, there are standards. However, there are many surveyors that will go rogue, which would be the appropriate descriptor, and they go rogue because of either facts that they believe are true, but they aren't, but they believe they're true, and they push them, or they've been to a seminar somewhere where somebody said something, they wrote it down, and they think that that's the spoken word, or they've read something and they've incorporated that into what they're doing. And so that's where a lot of the problem areas develop, is when there becomes this exchange, and in some respects it does become confrontational. I would hope not, but I have witnessed a few confrontational exchanges in my day, and that's when it becomes very unhealthy. Because again, the ultimate goal of the survey should be to make the organization better in the way that they process, better in the way that they handle their employees, better in the way that they problem think, better in the way that they look at quality and how they can improve. But unfortunately, when you get somebody who's extremely opinionated and you argue back with the facts, you might end up with deficiency. But that's when you need to go back and you need to find someone. If it's not the person that's responsible for writing the report, you need to find somebody who's very crafty with words to put the point forward in writing that the deficiency is unwarranted and this is why. And you need to be able to do that in writing. However, let me go backwards for a second. Part of the survey process is not only looking at your book that has all the instructions for use in it, all of the competencies, all of the training that's been done. It is the responsibility of the staff members and the managerial echelon of the department to be able to verbalize to the surveyor how, why, when, the advantages, the disadvantages of what they're using. And this is where the schooling is needed. Because if you have all of that information, the surveyor, if they are incorrect and not confrontational, will learn something also from the survey.
So, Barbara, kind of piggybacking off of that and piggybacking off of Hank's question, obviously there are a few areas that, things in the SPD world are very black and white. But then there's an awful lot of gray areas. And of course, as you mentioned, when that gray area really comes into play is when the surveyor has one interpretation of a gray area and you have a different interpretation of the gray area. How help us think through how best to approach those things in the midst of a survey.
This is truly a skill set that everyone should have. You're not going to go up to the surveyor with a 4x6 and hit the surveyor over the head and say you're wrong and start, wham-bamming them until they fall into the ground or fall over. There's a way to do it. And again, you can be assertive without being aggressive. And what I usually train people to do is that if you know that what's being said to you, in your heart of hearts you believe that you have the factual information. Again, you can be opinionated too, but that doesn't mean it's the facts. But if you have the facts and you believe the surveyor is incorrect, what I suggest at that point is you say to the surveyor, you're telling me that this is the case. Can you please show me in writing where that reference is? It's all the tone of voice. It's the way that you approach them. You don't get in their personal space. You don't raise a finger. You don't kind of raise your voice. As a matter of fact, for those that have a loud voice like myself, that's when my voice would become a very quiet voice because I wouldn't want them to get the wrong impression. However, if again you ask, can you please show me? And there have been many opportunities that in teaching organizations how to go through a survey, I will actually pick up a book, and I know a lot of people have them online now, but I'd actually pick up a book and take the book to the surveyor and say, geez, I've read this chapter over and over, and I'm just not finding the reference that you're citing. Can you please help me and show me where it is? Because I can't improve if I'm not understanding what you're saying. So it's all a matter of approach.
That assumes that you've read through that chapter many times as a leader, so hopefully this serves as an encouragement for those folks out there who maybe have those kinds of books on their shelves, but they're gathering a little bit of dust. Now's a good time to do the prep work on the front end to not only know those manufacturers' instructions for use, but also those recommendations out there and the regulatory standards as you distinguish as very helpful. Did want to ask a follow-up, though, maybe for leaders who have not ever been through a survey themselves, or maybe they have been through successful surveys but never had anything that was cited. Can you give us a thumbnail about kind of what's that next step? Let's say that you are tagged for something that is not according to the regulations out there. It probably varies depending on which accreditation organization you're working through.
So if it's an organization as in a hospital, usually there's a meeting of the managerial staff in the hospital, and then each of the chapters are then divvied out where the departments would have been scored on. And at that point, you will get a list of what your deficiencies are. They take very little in priding themselves to say what's positive, which is unfortunate. It really is all the negatives. And so you get that list, and then the first thing you need to do is you need to digest the list, if you have a group of managers, supervisors, leads in the department, get them together, read through it once so that you understand, at least in a community sense, you have an understanding as to what was being claimed to be deficient. And then what I like to do personally, and even in my own facilities, is I like to train people to look at that deficiency, take it back, have a staff meeting. There's nothing to hide. Go back to the staff, share the information, and sometimes the best ideas come from somebody who's usually very quiet in the department, believe it or not. And so look for different ways that you can solve the deficiency. Some items, as you've mentioned, are black and white, and if you needed to do something on a quarterly basis and you only did it twice a year and not 4 times a year, then that's an easy answer. Then you need to spoof up and get your reporting done so that it's done quarterly and not twice a year. However, if it's other things where you have some latitude and some flexibility, the staff can help managers become successful. Because ultimately, unless the manager is working in a staff position in his or her chain of responsibility, which happens with sick call-outs and all, your staff is the one who's going to actually have to employ and put into force the correction to the deficiency. So why not get them involved at that point in time? But the deficiency in the answer is pretty black and white. You would be answering it, and then in most health systems and organizations, it would go back up through the department that deals with the accreditation network. In surgical centers, it usually goes to the administrator, and the administrator gets to accumulate all of the responses, and then it gets sent back in one form. And then, unfortunately, today, if you're dealing with a state inspection, I don't know what the hang-up is, but this is in most state inspections, not all, but in most. Hardly a state that I know of will accept your plan of correction the first time. They'll send it back, and it's very defeating because they'll send it back, and it could be just a difference of a word or two or a sentence, but they'll send it back and make you look at it again and say, but you didn't address how often you're going to do this. So remember when you're writing the answer to a deficiency, who's going to fix it, when is it going to be fixed, what is going to be done, and never forget that in every deficiency, with far exception, education and training should be part of the response.
Well, we're obviously big believers in education and training here at Beyond Clean. That's one of the biggest methods, or I should say that's one of the biggest reasons why we started this podcast, was to bring that information and educate our listeners across the board. And as we're kind of wrapping up, Mike talked about gray areas. And as we know, gray areas lead to confusion and that lack of clarity. And we talked about in part one about having that level of confidence and how that can impact how the survey is going to go. Well, areas of confusion lead to people not being so confident. So are there any areas where the Joint Commission seems to be a little confused and maybe a little less consistent just by virtue of the industry?
I wouldn't just limit it to the Joint Commission. I would tell you that all the accrediting bodies, all the accrediting organizations have a certain element of opinions that are superseding what is in black and white. And they're not following the accreditation standards that have been laid out for them or the CMS conditions of coverage, which are very specific in nature. And so that is kind of a general answer, but it's a very important one, again, because organizations have a real issue in challenging accreditation organizations, and I will say especially the Joint Commission. But the Joint Commission is no different than DNV or AAAHC. And so the accreditation organizations, again, their own are not regulatory. They're regulatory only when they're conducting a deemed status survey. And so you have to make sure that as much as others will come into your home and challenge you, that you're willing to challenge back. And unfortunately, with payers and with constraints that have been put on any type, any size of an organization, usually it's harder to take the knock in, usually it's easier, to take the knock in the head rather than speak the truth and say, I'm sorry, but this is not the facts. These are the facts, and this is what you need to know. If a surveyor gets confused and says about a particular product, this product is known to be X, Y, and Z, and in fact the product is A, B, and C, then it's the responsibility of the organization, in my opinion, to say, well, that's not the fact. You need to understand that here it is and have the proof in writing and say, this is factual. There are lots of people that are running around this country saying about 510Ks. 510Ks wasn't something I ever knew until the last 10 years. A 510K is a static document. If a surveyor comes in and says, do you have the 510K for this product, whatever the product is, the answer should be, heck no, you don't need the 510K. It's not going to change. The important document is the manufacturer's and the current manufacturer's instructions for use. That's what you're to be held to. That is what every surveyor should be holding you to. And if they're not holding you to it, the Joint Commission, for example, in conversations with their legal counsel, has said that they will retrain their surveyor force to follow the manufacturer's instructions for use. And if they don't understand it, then they're to call the company. They're to call the manufacturer, because that's where the right answer or the correct answer is, not what somebody thinks. So thinking gets to be a little dangerous when you get it to be in opposition to what the facts are.
I think that's why there's so much training, especially as you and I have been in nursing school. That whole critical thinking skills was a big part of the curriculum in many nursing schools across the country. I think it's pretty standard today. But as we look at formalized education, which has been a topic of many of our episodes, and definitely ones with Harry Mullen recently, we talk about that critical thinking. But to your point, especially when it comes to the survey, keep it simple, and I think you said it best, just give them the answers to the question that they're asking versus going on a tangent. So all great information, Barbara. I really enjoyed part 2. And again, I just want to promote your appearance on our first ever panel discussion at the 2018 ISHM Annual Conference and Expo entitled Package Method Myth Busting. That was a 2-episode podcast for anybody who didn't catch it. Very popular podcast. And Barbara, you've been a gracious guest here on Beyond Clean once again. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences, and I just want to wish you all continued success in your endeavor here, because I think you're providing an incredible service to the learning community.
That was Barbara Harmer, Director of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies. We did talk a lot more about challenging the surveyor. Are they always right? What are the standards that are out there? What happens when they find something wrong? And really, Mike, I thought you asked the best question. There are gray areas in this industry, gray areas in the recommendations and standards. How does that play out in the context of a survey? What kind of confusion results from that, especially when dealing with the Joint Commission? So yet another great episode, and specifically on the topic of surveys and how to give you some real practical ideas for managing and living through that sometimes stressful experience.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, one of the most valuable things to come out of this was a simple step-by-step explanation about how to respond to a survey when you were either cited for a deficiency that you should have received or cited for a deficiency that you didn't deserve. I would recommend go back, listen to those again, take notes, because when that day comes and you need this, it's a tremendous opportunity to shine in front of your hospital administration, that when everybody else is freaking out and doesn't know how to respond, that you've already got your ducks in a row and know how exactly to respond to this situation. I mean, that's an incredibly invaluable tool.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know that that is Barbara's, what do we want to call it, 4th appearance on the show, between the Packaging Method Myth-Busting panel discussion from ISHM's annual conference and expo this past April and heading into May. I think it overlapped the 2 months. But great guest, great insights, and looking forward to having her on the show again at some point in the future. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes or Stitcher, and now also on Google Play and Spotify. Simply search for the Beyond Clean podcast. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review. We appreciate your feedback because it's important to the show and how we direct different topics in the future. And so if you have a recommendation on a topic or a guest that you'd like to see, just simply send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank, Mike, and myself, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond Clean.